You're now listening to Boring History for Sleep, the strange case of the Pope who declared a trial for a corpse. Let yourself relax as we drift into one of the strangest episodes in papal history. Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the rain-slicked cobblestones of Rome 897 AD, to be exact. You're trudging through alleyways that smell faintly of damp wool, boiled onions, and the distinct scent of politics gone rancid. The city is buzzing, but not the good kind of buzz, like a market festival or a coronation. No, this is a heavy, wet buzz, a murmur under the surface. Something is off, and by sunrise, it's going to be a full-blown nightmare dressed in ecclesiastical robes. You make your way past dripping cloaks and whispered prayers, following the flow of nervous clergy and squabbling nobles into the grand Lateran Basilica. Even the stone lions outside seem uncomfortable tonight, as if they too sense something unholy slouching toward the altar. Inside, flickering torches throw long shadows across a courtroom hastily assembled where sermons usually echo. You glance around and realize no one is quite sure how to act. After all, it's not every day the Pope puts a dead man on trial. You squint through the candlelight and see a body seated upright in the defendant's chair. A corpse, stiff, sagging, dressed in papal finery, as if nothing at all were wrong with this deeply unsettling tableau. Someone's taken the trouble to prop him up properly, even tying the corpse's hands so it doesn't flop off mid-trial. And yes, he's decaying. A little too dramatically for your taste. You're suddenly very aware that the basilica isn't particularly well ventilated. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're listening from now. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, because this is the strange, grotesque, and deeply political tale of the Cadaver Synod. It begins in chaos. Rome, at the close of the 9th century, isn't the marble-washed postcard version. This is a swamp of power grabs, turf wars, and a papacy that flips faster than a tavern pancake. Emperors come and go. Nobles bribe and backstab, and the Pope, well, the Pope is often a puppet, sometimes of a family, sometimes of a faction, and occasionally, just a very angry guy with a personal vendetta and a soft spot for theatrical revenge. Tonight's Pope is Stephen Vi. You watch as he paces the basilica floor like a man haunted. Perhaps he is. He looks like someone who hasn't slept in weeks, muttering beneath his breath, as if this bizarre trial might finally exorcise the demons he sees in every corner. His enemy? A man already dead, Pope Formosus. Now, you may be wondering, who digs up a predecessor and puts him on trial? Someone who really hated him. Stephen had come to power backed by the powerful Speleton family, and Formosus, while alive, had opposed them. That, combined with a papal career riddled with controversy, left Formosus a prime target. Dead, but not gone, and apparently not above legal consequences. So here we are, a murder mystery where the victim gets retroactively convicted of being annoying. As the night creeps deeper, you shuffle closer, curious and confused, like the rest of the half-horrified, half-morbidly entertained crowd. You catch snippets of Latin, something about usurping the papacy, about breaking church law, about being bishop of two places at once, a big ecclesiastical no-no. Apparently it's hard to concentrate with a corpse sitting 10 feet from you. You wonder if this is real. But the crackling torches, the solemn expressions, the robed bishops nodding along like this is totally fine. Yeah, it's real. Here's a mainstream fact to anchor you. This event, known officially as the Synodus Horrenda, yes, really, was a legitimate church council. Clergy were summoned, accusations were read, verdicts were passed. Even if the accused couldn't exactly respond, And here's your fringe tidbit. Some accounts claim the corpse gave off such an overwhelming stench that one priest fainted mid-testimony. Historians debate that detail. Of course it might just be morbid embellishment, or perhaps the basilica's incense budget had been tragically underused that month. You shuffle to the side as a monk walks by, whispering a joke to his companion. At least Formosus won't argue back. They both smirk and immediately cross themselves, lest they be smitten by divine irony. Historians still argue whether this entire affair was motivated by politics, madness, or some grotesque hybrid of both. Was Stephen coerced by his skeleton patrons? Was he unraveling mentally? Or was it a strategic ploy to rewrite papal legitimacy? Because invalidating Formosus's decisions also invalidates those he appointed, which conveniently clears a few power-hungry pathways. You press back into a cold marble pillar, watching as the storm outside thickens, wind pushing against the stained glass with a howling moan. It feels like the city is reacting, ashing, maybe, or furious, or possibly just wondering what on earth the Pope thinks he's accomplishing. One final note. You're still in the first act. The corpse is on trial, sure, but the real drama, the fallout, that's still brewing behind closed doors. And as the tribunal settles in for what promises to be the weirdest courtroom drama in history, you realize you've got a front row seat, and it's only going to get stranger from here. You're still sitting there, somewhere between fascinated and vaguely nauseous, as the corpse of Pope Formosus leans gently to one side, as if even in death, he's weary of the nonsense surrounding him. But to really understand why this bizarre scene is happening, you need to slip backward in time about a decade or two, when Formosus was still very much alive, breathing, and occasionally making choices that would come back to haunt him. Literally. You close your eyes, and when you open them, the Rome of the 870s unfolds before you. It's less of a bustling city and more of a pressure cooker. The Holy Roman Empire's grip is weakening, and the papacy, oh, it's like musical chairs. Except the chairs are on fire, and everyone's trying to trip each other. Formosus was once the Bishop of Porto, a prestigious seat just west of Rome. People respected him. He was articulate, persuasive, and, perhaps unfortunately a bit too politically ambitious for some. He served as a papal legate to the Bulgarians, who liked him so much they asked the Pope if Formosus could stay and be their archbishop forever. A charming compliment, sure, but in church politics, dangerous. You shift in your imaginary seat as the world around you flickers. Bishops glare, whispers fly, envy sharpens like a dagger, and Pope John VIII, the reigning pontiff at the time, decides that Formosus is getting just a little too popular for comfort. What follows is a deliciously petty feud that ends with Formosus being excommunicated, the charges leaving his post, without permission, attempting to claim another bishopric, and harboring ambitions to the papacy. You stifle a laugh. So, being a threat, then, got it. But here's your mainstream fact. Excommunications in this era were often politically motivated. Popes weren't above weaponizing church law to neutralize rivals. In fact, the rules were more like mildly enforced suggestions, with lots of angry scroll writing. Years later, after Pope John VIII was murdered, possibly by his own clergy, in what might be the worst office meeting in Vatican history, Formosus's fortunes reversed. The new regime lifted his excommunication, and by 891, he'd done the impossible. He became Pope. You blink. It's still raining in your head, though the papal tiara now rests atop Formosus's live brow. But being Pope wasn't quite the holy retirement plan people imagined. Formosus walked a tightrope. On one side was the Holy Roman Emperor, Arnulf of Carinthia. On the other, the powerful Speletan family Rome's reigning mafia in silk robes. And wouldn't you know it, Formosus chose a side. He backed Arnulf, even invited him to invade Italy and take the crown. That didn't sit well with the Speletans, who are like, oh, you thought you could just pick an emperor? Cute. But let's add your fringe detail here. Legend has it that during Formosus's coronation of Arnulf, a flock of crows landed on the altar, a bad omen in Roman superstition. Even medieval PR couldn't spin that. Still, Formosus pressed on. He crowned Arnulf emperor. And for a moment, it looked like maybe his chaotic career might end in stability. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Historians still argue whether Formosus ever truly trusted Arnulf, or if he simply played the only card he had against an increasingly hostile Roman nobility. What's clearer is that his papacy was riddled with anxiety, shifting alliances, and the looming sense that every decision he made might get him posthumously yelled at by some future pope. Which, well, he wasn't wrong. Formosus died in 896, probably of a stroke. A quiet end, finally, for a man whose life had been anything but. But his enemies weren't finished with him, not by a long shot. You shift scenes again. The air is thick with incense now, not to honor the dead, but to cover the scent of what comes next. Because with Formosus Dan, Arnulf's empire in freefall due to a sudden paralysis, medieval medicine was more vibes than science. The Speletons returned, and they brought with them their own pope, Stephen VI, a man who owed them everything. A man who needed to prove his loyalty in a very public, very disturbing way. And what better way to prove yourself than by digging up the last guy, dressing him in full papal robes, and putting him on trial? Makes sense, right? Spoiler, no, it does not. But you're still standing in the echo of Formosus's life. He wasn't a saint. He made enemies. He made moves. And now, you realize, he's about to make history, just not in a way anyone would envy. You're back inside the Lateran Basilica now, watching torchlight dance across gold-gilded arches and tapestries woven with saints who, thankfully, aren't alive to witness what's unfolding beneath their embroidered feet. The crowd is restless. The rain outside has turned the air heavy with mildew and candle wax, and you catch the sound of a sandal slipping on wet stone, followed by the soft thump of a clergyman hitting the floor. He's fine, just fainted. Again, you glance toward the altar, where Pope Stephen VI now sits, face clenched like a man chewing on his own rage. You wonder what thoughts must be ricocheting through his mind. Is this vengeance? A show of power? Or just an unhinged display orchestrated to keep the Speleton nobles smiling from their ivory towers? One thing's clear. This wasn't Stephen's idea. Alone behind every twitch of his robe and every finger he points at the rotting Formosus, there's a political hand guiding him. The Speleton dynasty, particularly Guy IV of Speleto and his family, had seen Formosus as a traitor. He had crowned their enemy, backed their rival, and now that they had their man in the papal chair, they were writing their own kind of justice. You wander mentally through the marble corridors of the Vatican, hearing whispered conspiracies echo off the walls. The College of Cardinals is divided. Some had served under Formosus, others loathed him, but most are just trying to stay alive. Being pope was becoming a shockingly dangerous gig like Musical Thrones, but with strangulations and surprise burials. Here's a mainstream fact for you to hold on to. During the late 800s, the papacy had become a revolving door. Between 8 and 965, there were 24 popes. That's a lot of hats changing heads. Many of them reigned for just months. Some were murdered. Some were exiled. Others, well, you're watching what happened to one of them right now. But the strangest part, this wasn't seen as all that absurd by some at the time. In fact, there are accounts, likely dramatized, but deliciously eerie, that suggests a few clergy members supported the corpse trial, not because they liked it, but because it gave them leverage. If you could accuse a dead pope of heresy, that meant you could undo his decisions. And Formosus had ordained a lot of bishops, so imagine you're a rival cleric. Your position wasn't looking too stable while Formosus was around. But now there's a chance to invalidate the very hand that placed your enemies in power. All it takes is one deeply disrespectful courtroom stunt. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit. Supposedly, one of the cardinals objected not to the trial itself, but to the corpse's posture. He wanted the dead pope to sit straighter. Protocol, he said. We can't have a slouching defendant. The macabre meets the bureaucratic. Historians still argue whether Stephen VI believed in the legitimacy of the Cadaver Synod, or if he was simply performing an act of grotesque obedience for his patrons. Some even speculate he was mentally deteriorating a pope unraveling in public, performing one last fevered gesture before the inevitable backlash. You shift focus now to the people in the crowd. Rome's nobles, clerics, monks, and even a few stunned peasants who had managed to squeeze into the back for this once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. A few seem entertained, like they're watching bad theater. Others are visibly disturbed, their eyes darting between the corpse and the man accusing it. You, though, you can't stop watching Stephen. He's screaming now. Latin curses laced with theological charges, perjury, violating canon law, aspiring to multiple bishoprics at once. He waves his arms like a street prophet, veins rising in his throat. Meanwhile, poor Formosus, what's left of him, isn't exactly mounting a defense. His skin's sunken in places. His lips are gone. He's dressed in the finest papal robes, sure, but the effect is more horror play than holy judgment. That's when the room quiets. A deacon steps forward. He bows deeply, then turns to face the crowd. He's about to do something completely unhinged. You see, since Formosus can't defend himself and, apparently, that matters in a fair trial, someone must act as his proxy. So the deacon begins, answering for the corpse, in a reedy nasal voice, mimicking Formosus. Yes, really. You stare. Is this happening? The deacon's voice rises and falls, pleading for forgiveness, refuting charges. At one point, he pauses as if waiting for the corpse to nod. It doesn't, and somewhere in the back, someone lets out the tiniest giggle before being immediately elbowed by a terrified friar. Welcome to the Cadaver Synod, where trials are theatrical, guilt is assumed, and the defense counsel is pretending to be your decomposing body. The sheer absurdity would be funny, if it weren't also a deeply chilling reminder of how power works. If a pope can be tried posthumously, what's stopping anyone from being declared a heretic, traitor, or fraud, no matter how dead they are? You glance around the room. Every face here knows. This isn't about Formosus anymore. It's a warning, and that makes the silence that follows all the more terrifying. The hush in the basilica stretches into something thick, like wet wool draped over your ears. You blink and glance again at the pitiful figure slumped in judgments, seat Pope Formosus, or what's left of him, staring out with sockets that once held eyes but now seem to bore through eternity. The deacon who represented him has stepped aside, wiping sweat from his brow like a stage actor. After a particularly grueling monologue, you might be tempted to think it's over now. Charges have been read. A silent defendant has been heard. Surely, that's the end. Oh, sweet summer child. What comes next turns grim theater into grotesque spectacle. Pope Stephen VI, looking more frayed at the seams by the hour, rises. With a flourish and bellows the verdict. Guilty. Astonishing, right? He declares that Formosus had never truly been pope. That all his actions, every bishop he ordained, every decree he made are null and void. It's a bureaucratic nuke dropped from beyond the grave. And then, the punishment. You lean forward, not wanting to look, but unable to look away. Two monks approach the corpse with a kind of hesitant dread. They unfasten the papal robes, layer by layer, stripping the body of its holy vestments. You can almost hear the silk sliding against parchment dry skin. Someone gasps. Someone else whispers a prayer. Then the real horror begins. They bring out a small blade, and with a kind of terrible reverence, they begin to cut off the fingers Formosus once used to bless the people, the consecrated fingers. Not all of them, just the two that mattered. The forefinger and middle finger of the right hand, used in the sacred gesture of benediction. You feel an ache in your stomach as you imagine the grisly sound of dried flesh snapping under pressure. It doesn't take much. Formosus has been dead for over 9 months, and nature has done half the job already. Here's your mainstream fact. In Catholic tradition, the right hand of the Pope holds tremendous symbolic power. Cutting off those fingers was the ultimate way to say, your blessings don't count. You were never legitimate. And here's your quirky detail. Some whispered accounts from the 10th century claimed that the severed fingers were thrown into the street and picked up by a stray dog, who promptly ran off with them into the alleys of Rome. Others suggest they were burned. Some say they were buried in secret by a guilt-ridden monk. Either way, no relics of those fingers survive. Historians still argue whether this punishment was purely symbolic or part of a broader clerical purge. After all, if Formosus's acts were void, then so were the bishops he ordained, and wouldn't. You know, it's some of those bishops had inconvenient loyalties. It was all so neatly convenient, back in the basilica. Stephen is pacing again, robe dragging behind him like a snake with too many regrets. He's not done. You follow the procession as they lift Formosus's limp body, now stripped of robes and dignity alike, and carry him out of the church like refuse. The candlelight flickers against the marble as the doors swing open, revealing the soggy city beyond. The trial is over, but the sentence continues. Down muddy alleys and rain-slicked stone, the group hauls the corpse through the city. A few brave onlookers follow, holding their robes above the muck, trying not to look too interested and failing spectacularly. Eventually, you arrive at the Tiber River, swollen with rain and secrets. The sky above is dark, so dark you can't tell whether it's dusk or divine disappointment. With a final, wordless heave, they toss Formosus's corpse into the water. You don't hear a splash. You don't hear anything. Just the sound of rain falling on stone and the silence of justice, carried out long past its expiration date. Here's the moment you realize something else. This wasn't just political. This was ritual humiliation, a symbolic erasure. Stephen wasn't content with victory. He needed spectacle. Needed to show the world that Formosus was not merely wrong, he was unholy, tainted, and unworthy, even in death. And yet, you sense a strange reversal in the air, a chill that wasn't there before. Because despite the ritual and the pageantry, despite the public trial and the desecration, Formosus is still very much present in everyone's minds. The corpse may be gone, but the story, it's just beginning. In the days that follow, Rome buzzes like a beehive kicked down a well. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some say the corpse washed ashore, bloated but intact. Others claim a fisherman found it tangled in reeds and buried it secretly out of pity. And then there are whispers, quiet, nervous ones, about curses, about bad omens, about how you really shouldn't mess with the dead, especially not dead popes. Stephen VI had wanted to erase a rival. Instead, he created a martyr, a symbol, a grotesque monument to the madness of power. And you're standing there in the rain, staring down at the dark water, realizing you've just witnessed something that will echo for centuries. Days pass, maybe weeks. You can't tell anymore, moves in a blur now. The corpse is gone, the basilica's been scrubbed, and the papal throne still sits under its shimmering canopy, but the air hasn't cleared. Not really. You wander through the halls of the Lateran again, but this time the whispers are louder. Clergy murmur to one another, glancing behind their backs. Cardinals pray a little harder than usual. Someone dropped a communion chalice last night, just slipped right out of their hands during Mass, and 3 people gasped like they'd seen the gates of hell crack open. Because the truth is, Even the boldest attendees of the Cadaver Synod are now wondering, did we go too far? You stop near a stained glass window where the candlelight glimmers across a scene of St. Peter. He looks disapproving today, probably imagining what his successors have been up to, probably wondering why. No one stopped Stephen when the corpse got propped up on the throne like it was auditioning for a macabre puppet show. Yes, that happened. Let's talk about it. Before the trial began, Pope Stephen VI ordered Formosis's corpse to be dressed in papal regalia and physically seated on the papal throne. Not a symbolic chair tucked into a corner. The actual, literal throne from which Peter's successors ruled, and their Formosus sat decomposed, dressed in glory, flopped slightly sideways, while a court of living men hurled accusations at him. You think it's overblown, an exaggeration. Here's your mainstream fact. Multiple contemporary sources, including church chroniclers, confirmed the corpse's presence in full papal attire during the trial. It wasn't metaphorical. It wasn't a painting. It was him. They even tied him upright to prevent slumping. Medieval puppeteering at its most morbid. And here's your quirky detail. Some accounts claimed that a crown, likely a symbolic one, not the full papal tiara, was tilted atop his rotting scalp, and because of the weight of decomposition, it kept falling off, so they nailed it on. Now, to be fair, historians still argue about the exact level of theatricality. Was it truly that extreme, or are we hearing the echoes of medieval sensationalism, where scribes leaned into the horror to make a point? After all, nothing reinforces a moral quite like a rotting pope in ceremonial robes. Still, even if half the details are embellishment, the spirit of it is real. It was meant to shame, to undo Formosis's legacy by turning his very body into a spectacle. His corpse, once dignified in a tomb, now a grotesque marionette performing penance before the court of the living. And let's be honest, Stephen probably enjoyed it. At least, at first. But something starts to shift. The synod had been meant to cleanse the papacy, to assert Stephen's power, to please the and yet, somehow, it begins to backfire. You stroll through a Roman market one morning, and overhear two fishmongers muttering about omens. One claims he saw blood bubbling from a fountain. Another swears her chickens refused to lay eggs the day Formosus was tossed into the river. Silly stuff. Maybe, but that's the thing about public superstition. It spreads faster than dogma, faster than papal bulls or edicts. And soon the whispers grow teeth. Someone saw a crow land on the altar again. Someone else says their ox dropped dead after they laughed at a joke about Formosus's toes. You even hear one guard mumble that his hair fell out after standing too close to the trial bench. Coincidence? Probably. But Rome isn't built on coincidence. It's built on layers of belief, stacked like limestone, faith, fear, and politics all blurring into one endless, sacred anxiety. And here's where it gets truly ironic. Stephen begins to unravel. You see him again, pacing, 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 his eyes darting to shadows. He doesn't smile much anymore. The very throne he once stormed is now something he avoids sitting on for long. Even the basilica feels heavier, as if the marble remembers, because Formosus dead and fading. He's looming. You overhear a bishop mutter, "I think we made a ghost." Another answers, "We made a martyr." Historians now point to this shift as a critical moment when public opinion turned, not just among peasants and merchants, but clergy. Cardinals who had stayed silent began whispering discontent. A few started speaking openly, calling the synod a farce. A few even argued that by putting a pope on trial, Stephen had committed heresy himself. Upstat. You walk past the Tiber one night and catch a glint near the Banca Rumor in the form of a shape. Some say Formosus's body washed up not long after the trial, that someone pulled it from the muck, cleaned it, and reburied it in secret. Others say he drifted to the sea, cursed to roam forever like an ecclesiastical Flying Dutchman. There's No consensus, only fog and fear. And then, one day, you wake to news that Stephen VI has been arrested, not deposed, not politely removed, arrested. A mob, or perhaps the clergy themselves, it's unclear, stormed the palace, dragged him out of bed, barefoot and shrieking, imprisoned him in a dark cell where no crown could protect him. You walk past that cell weeks later, and it's empty. Stephen's been strangled in the night, whether it was punishment, revenge, or the silent hand of God, that's up for debate. But one thing is clear, as you leave the Vatican walls behind, Rome remembers, and it never forgets a corpse trial. You find yourself standing once again in the Lateran Basilica. But something has changed. The air is still thick, the marble still cool beneath your feet, and the candles still tremble in their sconces, but the silence has shifted. Before, it was ominous. Now, it's exhausted. The Cadaver Synod has come and gone. Pope Stephen VI is dead, strangled in a prison cell, barely lit enough to see the walls. And yet, Rome isn't any quieter for it. If anything, it's louder. Gossip is louder. Politics is louder. And somewhere, over the hum of whispered penance and roasted chestnuts on street corners, there's a question brewing. Now what? Because when you put a corpse on trial, when you cut off its holy fingers and throw it into a river, it doesn't just vanish. It lingers like mold in old bread, or the smell of incense clinging to your robes. And now, every bishop, cardinal, and papal contender is left asking whether anything still counts. You sit quietly on a pew near the back as a new pope is being crowned. They're calling him Pope Romanus, a name so short and uncertain it practically shrugs. He's supposed to clean things up, to calm things down. You watch his coronation, and even from your seat, you can tell this man is terrified. Romanus's papacy doesn't last long, maybe a few months. Some say he was too gentle. Others whispered that he tried to undo Stephen's actions, but lacked the spine to follow through. But no matter the cause, one fact stands: he disappears, not dies, not murdered, just quietly replaced, as if Rome collectively agreed to pretend he never happened. You imagine him slipping out the back door of the Vatican at night, robes trailing behind him like a ghost already forgotten. Next comes Pope Theodore II. And here's where things get even stranger. Theodore doesn't just try to reverse Stephen's rulings, he succeeds. In a whirlwind few weeks, he nullifies the Cadaver Synod, declares Formosus a true pope again. And get this, has the body retrieved from wherever it was dumped and reburied with honor. That's your mainstream fact right there. Yes, Formosus gets a second funeral. This time, it's quiet, reverent, no shouting, no corpse on a throne drama, just candles, prayers, and what historians politely call dignity restoration. You try to picture the scene: somber monks unrolling a muddy bundle of vestments, carefully placing bones back into silk, into marble, into peace. The church wants closure, wants to forget. But Rome doesn't forget easily, because just when things start to settle, the papal carousel spins again. New factions rise, old ones fester, and suddenly, bam, Pope Sergius III takes the throne. And guess what? He hated Formosus. Sergius had been around during the Cadaver Synod. Some even say he helped organize it. And now that he's pope, he brings it all back like a terrible sequel no one asked for. He reinstates the Cadaver Synod's verdicts, declares Formosus's papacy illegitimate again. For a while, the church operates like Formosus never existed, or worse, like he was an infection that needed purging. You shake your head. It's papal flip-flopping at Olympic levels. Here's your quirky tidbit. At one point, Sergius even had the tomb of Formosus opened again, not to rebury him, not to honor him, just to look, like he was checking that the body hadn't gotten up and walked away. Historians still argue whether this was paranoia or some twisted show of dominance? Was Sergius just covering his bases, or was it a power move, a final symbolic victory over an enemy who somehow kept haunting him from the grave? You lean against a sun-warmed wall near St. John Lateran and watch pigeons pick at breadcrumbs, scattered by a barefoot nun. Even the birds seem uncertain these days, because beneath all the politics and parchment, there's something deeper going on, something human. This isn't just about laws or thrones or who wore what might or when. It's about fear. Fear that power isn't permanent, that legitimacy can be rewritten, that death doesn't protect you from disgrace, and maybe most chillingly that, in the hands of the wrong people, sacred things can become tools. The papal chair, a symbol of spiritual guidance. Turns out, it's also a very convenient stage prop. And the corpse of Formosus. In the end, he became more powerful in death than he ever was in life. Not because of any miracle, not because of martyrdom, but because the men who tried to erase him couldn't stop talking about him. You pause near a fresco depicting the early apostles, Peter, Paul, Andrew, all painted with calm eyes and peaceful halos. You wonder what they'd make of the past few years. Probably wouldn't approve of corpse trials. Probably would have skipped the finger-snipping. But then again, they weren't trying to manage a kingdom pretending to be a church, or a church pretending to be a kingdom. You take one last look at the altar. Formosus is gone. Stephen is gone. Sergius will soon be gone too. But the story, the story is very much alive. The sun hangs low over Rome, casting long shadows that stretch like fingers across crumbling statues and cobbled lanes. You wander past a fountain trickling softly, the only witness to secrets whispered centuries ago. Somewhere behind you, the basilica bells tolled the hour, but they feel ceremonial now, distant, like echoes of a church unsure of what it stands for anymore. You're thinking about justice, about ritual, about how one decaying body could bring so much turbulence to an institution supposedly built on peace. But mostly, you're thinking about what happens after the storm, because the trial is over. The body's been buried, dug up, reburied, and judged again in absentia more times than you can count. And now, the church faces something it's not great at handling: embarrassment. You duck into a quiet chapel and let the silence wrap around. You, a monk nearby, is repairing a candle holder, humming a flat hymn under his breath. It's peaceful, until you glance at the altar and see a small icon of Pope Formosus, his name scratched faintly in Latin beneath his painted feet. So, not forgotten after all. Here's your mainstream fact. Formosus remained a controversial figure long after his burial. Future popes alternately condemned and honored him, depending on which faction they owed their loyalty to. His name was invoked in political arguments for decades, in some regions, even into the 11th century. His ordinations were still being challenged, and here's a quirky tidbit for your sleep-deprived brain to chew on. For a brief moment in church history, there was a rumored relic, not a bone fragment or shroud, but the chair Formosus had been seated in during the Cadaver Synod. Supposedly, a bishop kept it hidden in a monastery cellar for years, believing it carried either a curse or a strange sort of power. No one ever confirmed that story. But wouldn't you love to see that episode of Antiques Roadshow? You walk now through the Roman Forum, past broken columns and overgrown altars. You're struck by something that feels almost cruel in its irony. Rome, the eternal city, seems designed to bury the past beneath the present, and yet it keeps resurfacing. Statues erode, popes fall, bodies are thrown into rivers, but the stories rise, and that's where you find yourself now, deep in the murky waters of memory. Not history books, not theology, just memory, the kind of memory that won't stay buried. No matter how many fingers you cut off or robes you strip away. You pause near the Tiber River, staring at the surface as dusk settles over the city. This is the same river Formosus was tossed into, and while most people have long forgotten that detail, You swear you can still feel it in the air. That subtle wrongness, like something sacred was violated, and the river never quite forgave. Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod was a one-time aberration or a symptom of a deeper disease, whether it reflected the rot of the era, or simply the madness of one man backed by the wrong nobles. But here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to dwell on. It worked. Stephen VI achieved his goal, at least temporarily. He reversed Formosis's legacy. He reshaped papal law. He intimidated rivals. And for a brief, terrifying moment, he held the church hostage with a corpse and a throne. You keep walking and notice a beggar sitting on the cathedral steps, carving a small wooden figure with a crooked smile. It takes you a second, but you realize it's a pope, not a saint, not Christ. Just a tiny, hunched pope, seated stiffly in what looks suspiciously like a courtroom chair. Even the street corners remember. And that's the legacy no one expected, because the Cadaver Synod wasn't just about revenge or legality, was about power's performance, about how far someone would go to make a point, and how fragile truth becomes when it's drowned in robes, rituals, and river water. You glance up at the Vatican dome in the distance, a future palace for popes yet unborn. It seems so serene now, glistening in twilight. But beneath that polished surface is a past built on graves and guesses. A palace haunted not by ghosts, but by precedent. Because if a pope can be tried after death, who's truly safe? Not emperors, not bishops, not even history itself. You hear a voice behind you, a passerby arguing with a merchant over the price of dates, but for a moment, it echoes strangely, like Latin, like an echo from a marble chamber. 9 centuries gone, the Cadaver Synod is over, but its echo still flickers in the candlelight of every courtroom, every pulpit, every sermon that wrestles with the limits of righteousness. You shake the thought away gently. Time to find somewhere to rest. The night is long. The night deepens as you step into a narrow Roman alley, lit by nothing more than a distant lantern and the faint glimmer of the moon. The city has quieted, but your thoughts haven't. They keep looping back over the corpse, the throne, the shouting pope. You wonder if anyone ever really moved on from that moment, or if Rome, like the river, just carries the memory downstream. Because something odd began to happen after the Cadaver Synod. A series of misfortunes, one after another, almost comical in their timing. You weren't one of the popes dying. That is, you take a seat on a cracked marble bench near the Pantheon. Pigeons have gone to roost. The square is empty, but your mind is full, replaying the peculiar sequence of events that followed Pope Stephen VI's dramatic downfall. You see, in the space of just a few years, popes began to die. A lot. Here's your mainstream fact. Between 896 and 904 AD, the papacy saw 7 different popes, many reigning less than a year. Some were deposed. One was reportedly blinded and left to die. Others simply vanished, and nobody could keep the names straight anymore. Pope Boniface V lasted 2 weeks. Pope Romanus, barely a blip on the map. Pope Leo V, deposed, then murdered. In prison, you can't help but imagine a medieval cleric sitting in a corner office with a stack of nameplates, sighing every Monday. Another one already? Even the most devout began to wonder, was the papacy cursed? Here's your quirky detail. A few obscure chroniclers claimed that a shadowy figure, a black-robed man with no face, was seen walking the basilica halls each time a pope died. Pure legend, of course. Or maybe just a stressed-out monk who'd had enough and decided to spook the clergy into better behavior. But those stories gained traction because they felt true. After all, something clearly wasn't right. Historians still argue whether the rapid turnover of popes in this period reflected divine punishment, factional warfare, or simply Rome being Rome, chaotic, power-hungry, and filled with men who all wanted the same golden hat. You rise and begin to walk again, passing a wall covered in flaking fur. You think of the papal tombs, some still honored, others hidden, a few likely desecrated by rivals whose names have since faded into dust. The idea of a curse might be melodramatic, sure, but you don't have to believe in ghosts to believe in consequence, because what the Cadaver Synod did, what it really did, was break something sacred. Not dogma, not canon law, but trust. Trust in the papacy's dignity. Trust that the church, despite its flaws, at least understood the line between justice and spectacle. Once that line was crossed, once a dead pope was put on trial, there was no going back. Every pope afterward had to wonder, will I be next? Will my decisions be reversed? Will my bones be yanked from their resting place and paraded like a warning? You step inside a chapel, tucked between two leaning buildings. Inside, a single candle burns, its light reflecting off the gold leaf halo of an ancient icon. You sit for a while, letting the stillness wrap around you. It's here you remember something crucial. The Cadaver Synod didn't end the church. It didn't fracture the papacy beyond repair, but it did something subtler. It planted a seed of doubt, and that seed grew into centuries of whispered uncertainty. Would the papacy recover? Yes. Would it reign in majesty again? Certainly. But that little thread of farsouf theater, disguised as theology, ever quite unraveled from the fabric, and you can't help but wonder, if a future pope ever feared disgrace, what would stop him from rewriting the past? Not a corpse. Clearly, you smile softly. Not because it's funny, but because history has such an uncanny way of looping in on itself. One era's scandal becomes another's bedtime story. You stand once more and make your way toward the Tiber. The waters, calm tonight, but it's never still. Underneath, it carries the weight of centuries' ashes, bones, silt, and secrets. You lean on the railing and peer into the dark. Somewhere beneath the surface, a papal ring lies lost, fingers long decayed, trial concluded, but the story floats forever. You wake the next morning to sunlight slicing through the shutters of your small Roman lodging. But even daylight can't quite dispel the strange, echoing feeling left by last night's thoughts. You rise slowly, stretch, and glance out the window toward the dome of St. Peter's in the distance, shimmering like a crown for a city that never really stopped being a kingdom unto itself. Your feet carry you again toward the Vatican, not because anything new is happening there, but because, in a way, everything always is. You wander through sun-dappled courtyards and echoing stone halls until you reach the archives. The cool air smells of parchment, wax, and history. You can almost hear the scratch of quills from centuries past. Somewhere in these shelves, you realize, are transcripts of the Cadaver Synod, actual Latin documents recording every bizarre, accusatory word flung at a corpse that couldn't respond. The church keeps everything, you think, even the embarrassing parts. Especially the embarrassing parts. That's part of what fascinates you. The paradox. The church tried to erase Formosus, then it tried to restore him, then it tried to forget the whole thing ever happened. And yet, it kept the receipts. You run your fingers gently along the spines of volumes too fragile to open. Bound in leather, etched with gold, full of drama the world pretends to have moved past. And maybe it has, but you haven't. Not yet. You take a seat on a bench nestled in a cloister garden. Bees hum lazily between lavender bushes. A young seminarian walks by, nose in a theology textbook, utterly unaware that the very ground he's walking on once witnessed ecclesiastical absurdity of Shakespearean proportions. Because here's a thing people don't realize. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a scandal, it became a template. Not literally, of course. No pope since has dared to dig up a predecessor and yell at him in public. But the idea that you could revise papal legacy, that precedent stuck around like incense smoke in an old chapel. Here's your mainstream fact. Even centuries later, popes continued to debate, revisit, and sometimes undo the decisions of their predecessors. Whole councils were called to settle what earlier popes had declared infallible. The church would grow more structured, more codified, yes, but the ghost of Formosus always lingered, reminding every new pontiff, what you do might not stay done. And here's a delightfully strange tidbit. In the 17th century, a theater troupe in Venice staged a black comedy about the Cadaver Synod. It featured puppets, exaggerated gestures, and a pope with a squeaky voice berating a skeleton. It was banned, naturally, but not before drawing packed crowds, because who doesn't love a little heresy with their wine? Historians still argue whether the Cadaver Synod represents the church at its worst or its most human. Was it a grotesque overreach of spiritual power, or was it just petty men playing dress-up in divine clothing? You sit with that for a while, let it settle, because honestly, it's both. It was tragic, absurd, infuriating, ridiculous, but also so deeply, unmistakably human. Men make mistakes. Men crave control. And sometimes, when those men wear holy robes, the results are, exhumed and paraded in front of a court like a low-budget horror play. And yet, the church endured. That's the other part of the story. After all the chaos, all the posturing, the papacy stabilized. It grew more ceremonial, more cautious. Later centuries would be filled with reform and ritual, with towering figures like Gregory VII and Innocent III restoring dignity, or at least the illusion of it. But deep in the footnotes, the Cadaver Synod never really went away. You lean back on the bench and watch a butterfly hover near a crumbling statue of St. Jerome, and for a second, you imagine what Jerome might say about all this. Probably something scathing in Latin, with a heavy sigh, because ultimately, the Cadaver Synod wasn't about theology. Not really. It was about memory. Who gets to write it? Who gets to edit it? And who gets dragged from their grave to pay for being on the wrong side of it? You close your eyes. Somewhere in the archives, a brittle page still bears the signature of Pope Stephen VI. Somewhere in a riverbed, maybe a splinter of Formosus's broken ring lies nestled in stone. And somewhere, in the hearts of those who study these things too closely, the line between reverence and absurdity continues to blur, because history, much like theology, doesn't always reward the righteous. Sometimes, it just remembers the loudest. You linger on that thought, wandering slowly through the Vatican gardens, as the sun dips lower behind St. Peter's dome. The evening light turns everything a soft gold. The hedges, the fountains, even the gravel underfoot seems blessed for a moment. But beneath the beauty, the absurdity still hums, like a lute string that's never quite stopped vibrating since that strange day in 897. You find a quiet corner, beside an old olive tree, and take a seat. The breeze is gentle now, almost whispering. And in it, you hear echoes, not the kind that scare children, but the kind that remind you that stories never really end. They just lose their audience. The Cadaver Synod is one of those stories. You try to picture Pope Formosus, not as a corpse propped in robes, but as a man, alive, breathing, making decisions, signing scrolls, whispering prayers, wondering maybe if what he did would last, or if the politics would devour it all. And then you picture him as history chose to remember him, stiff, bloated, dressed for a performance he never auditioned for. That image is hard to shake. Here's your final mainstream fact. The Catholic Church has never formally erased or recondemned the Cadaver Synod. It remains one of those strange, unquiet moments in its 2,000-year history, a footnote in official chronicles, a quiet wince among canon lawyers, and a gold mine for medieval scholars. And here's a final, quirky detail for the dreamers. A few medieval satirists claimed that Formosus's ghost roamed the corridors of the papal palace for decades after the trial, carrying his severed fingers in one hand and pointing accusingly at anyone who spoke too loudly in Latin. It was, of course, a joke, probably. Historians still argue fiercely about what the synod meant. Some say it was the natural end of a chaotic era. Others argue it was the beginning of a long overdue conversation about papal accountability. A few just shake their heads and mutter, "Only in Rome." But you've walked through it all now. You've seen the throne, the court, the river. You've followed the popes who rose and fell in the shadows of one man's restless bones. You've heard the whispers, the creaks of old wood, the laughter of cynical monks, the sighs of tired bishops. You know this wasn't just about a trial. It was about how power fears memory and how memory refuses to stay buried. You rise from the bench and take one last look at the Vatican skyline. The windows glint, the bells toll once, gently and you know the story's finished. But before you go, let's slow it down now. Let the breeze quiet, let the pages close softly. The Vatican fades behind you as your footsteps soften into silence. The cobblestones grow smoother, the air warmer. The drama of marble halls and shouting popes begins to drift further from your mind, like incense smoke curling into the rafters of a quiet cathedral. All that noise, all that fury, all those strange decisions made by men in ornate robes, it begins to blur now. What once felt so vivid now softens into dream stuff. The corpse on the throne, he's just a name now, a shadow in history's long corridor. The Pope, who tried him, forgotten by most. The trial, a page in a book no one reads before bed. But here, tonight, in this gentle moment, you held that page in your hands, and now you can set it down. Take a deep breath, let your shoulders ease. The questions of justice, of power, of how memory bends under pressure, they can rest too, just for now. Outside your window, the night wraps around the world like a soft cloak. Somewhere, the Tiber still flows. Somewhere, candles flicker in quiet chapels. And somewhere, far beyond time, even Formosus himself might be smiling at the absurdity of it all. You're safe, you're warm, and the story is over. For now, sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.